They expected to die the moment they entered the Flak corridor. Every B-17 crew knew the sight. Black bursts rising in mechanical steps, each explosion placed exactly where the German predictors believed a bomber would be seconds later. But on the frozen morning the trick first appeared, something happened no gunner on the ground could explain. A formation of flying fortresses pushed straight into the barrage, slow, heavy, predictable, and yet the shells kept bursting in the wrong places. Too high, too low, too far ahead. The sky should have been a cage built from mathematics, but the bombs followed their path untouched, as if the aircraft were slipping through cracks no one else could see. One German officer shouted over the gun crews, demanding recalculations. Another tapped the predictor housing, convinced the timing gears had jammed, but the bombers kept coming, shimmering in the winter light, untouched by hits that should have torn them apart. Allied crews began whispering afterward that there was a method known only to select pilots that could break the precision of German fire control computers without any visible evasive maneuver. A technique so subtle it could not be seen from the ground, but devastating enough to turn entire missions. Like and subscribe for more true stories from the shadows of history, and keep watching to see the trick that let B-17 crews fly through Flak without being hit. By 1943, every crewman aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress understood the brutal arithmetic of a bombing run over Germany. The aircraft's strength, its rigid stability, its ability to hold formation, its consistent altitude became its greatest vulnerability the moment it entered a flak belt. To deliver bombs accurately, the fortress had to fly straight and level for long stretches. No dives, no sudden turns, no breakaways. The Germans knew this and built their air defenses around it. Cities like Bremen, Hanover, and Schweinfurt were ringed with synchronized batteries, each linked to analog fire control computers capable of predicting where a bomber would be 3, 5, even 8 seconds into the future. Inside those machines, gears spun, cams rotated, and clockwork logic produced firing angles with chilling precision. German crews trusted them completely, and often they were right too. Entire bomber groups had been shattered because the predictors only needed one unchanging variable, a steady target. For Allied airmen, flying into Flak felt like entering a mechanical trap, one designed to punish discipline and reward nothing. They knew that even a minor alteration in altitude could spoil a calculation, but the rules of the mission forbade visible maneuvering. The formation depended on consistency more than creativity. Yet in that rigid world, there were anomalies, moments when Flak bursts drifted off timing for reasons nobody could explain. Most crews blamed wind, chance, or operator error. A few men, however, sensed there was something deeper at work. The breakthrough began with a detail so small most crews never noticed it. During a winter mission over central Germany, Lieutenant Harold Keenan, bombardier of the lead ship, studied the Flak bursts through his Norden bomb sight. He expected the usual pattern: explosions walking steadily toward the formation as the German predictors refined their timing. Instead, he saw something strange. Every time the B-17 dipped slightly into a cold downdraft, the bursts detonated just above or ahead of the bomber's path, as though the guns were firing at a target that existed only on paper. After landing, Keenan compared notes with the flight engineer, Sergeant Martin Cole, who had been tracking subtle barometric fluctuations for weeks. Cole had noticed that winter air over frozen fields created irregular density layers, thin pockets of rising and sinking air that nudged the aircraft a few meters higher or lower without the pilot making any deliberate move. The change was too small to feel, too gentle to register as a maneuver, but large enough to distort the predictor's assumption of a constant altitude. Together, they tested a theory. If these natural downdrafts could be anticipated, timed, and matched with controlled micro-adjustments, the bomber's future position would fall outside the German computer's projected arc. On the next sortie, they tried it. The result was unmistakable: Flak detonated in empty sky. The discovery was kept quiet, whispered only among crews they trusted. Next, you'll find out how this fragile insight became a technique used in combat. The first true test came on a mission toward Berlin, where the flak belts were dense enough to darken the horizon. The lead plane of the formation Keenan and Cole's crew entered the corridor knowing they had only a narrow margin for error. The pilot kept his hands steady on the yoke as Cole monitored the aneroid altimeter, calling out slight shifts in air pressure. When the downdraft arrived, they didn't fight it. Instead, the pilot allowed the aircraft to sink a few meters, then eased it back up in a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the natural movement of the air. To anyone watching from the ground, the bomber appeared perfectly level, but inside the cockpit, each adjustment was timed with precision, never more than a few meters, never fast enough to signal an evasive maneuver, never so large that the formation lost cohesion. Yet the effect on German fire control computers was immediate. Predictors, built on the assumption of stable altitude, fired at positions the B-17 no longer occupied by the time the timed fuses detonated. Other crews began adopting the technique. Some relied on the navigator's pressure readings, others trained themselves to feel the subtle tremors of an approaching downdraft. The formation moved with a kind of hidden pulse, imperceptible externally, but crucial internally. Mission reports showed an unusual pattern. Aircraft that used the technique consistently emerged with fewer flak strikes. For a brief period, this quiet method shifted survivability in the air. The reports coming from German flak batteries in early 1944 showed a pattern their officers could not ignore. Crews filed complaints about erratic altitude behavior among American bombers, insisting their predictors were producing incorrect firing solutions. Technicians recalibrated optics and timing mechanisms, checked barometric inputs, and even replaced mechanical components they believed were worn or misaligned. Yet no matter how often the machines were serviced, the same inconsistency persisted. Shells were exploding just outside lethal range. From the American side, the results were clear but quietly discussed. Aircraft returning from missions over heavily defended targets showed fewer punctures, fewer damaged control surfaces, and fewer wounded crew members, outcomes difficult to attribute to luck alone. The trick spread through informal channels, exchanged in hushed cockpit conversations rather than formal briefings. Some groups benefited greatly. Others, unaware or unconvinced, continued to absorb heavy losses. But the advantage had limits. As winter air gave way to spring, the temperature layers that created reliable downdrafts began to flatten. Without those natural vertical pulses, the micro-adjustment technique became more difficult to execute with precision. Later that same year, the introduction of radar-assisted predictors in German batteries reduced the impact of altitude irregularities. What had worked for a short, crucial window began to lose its edge. Still, for the crews who used it, the method remained a rare example of outthinking a mechanical system built for destruction. Next, you'll learn why the trick faded into obscurity and why it was never formally recorded. In the years that followed, the method slipped quietly out of operational memory. It had never been written into manuals, never briefed formally, and never standardized across the 8th Air Force. Its success depended on conditions that were as fragile as they were temporary cold air, unstable pressure layers, and the experience of crews who could sense the sky's subtle movements. As the war progressed, many of those veterans rotated home, replaced by younger airmen who trained on newer procedures and relied more heavily on instruments than intuition. Without deliberate preservation, the technique faded, surviving only as a story passed between a handful of surviving pilots. Technological changes sealed its disappearance. Radar-guided predictors no longer relied solely on assumptions of stable altitude, reducing the vulnerability that crews like Keenan and Cole had exploited. Later generations of aircraft, designed for higher speeds and different operational profiles, no longer flew the rigid, predictable paths that made the trick necessary in the first place. What had been a fleeting advantage became an artifact of a specific moment, one defined by mechanical computers, winter weather, and the narrow margins of bomber warfare. Yet the idea remains a reminder of the quiet ingenuity that shaped the air war. In a conflict dominated by industrial firepower and strict procedure, survival sometimes came not from new machines, but from understanding an old one's limitations. For a brief time, a few crews found a way to slip through the geometry of destruction, guided not by technology, but by the rhythm of the sky itself.